Welcome to Changing Voices in Higher Education, the podcast where we explore the evolving landscape of learning, leadership, and innovation on campuses around the world. I'm your host, Shamima Raihan Manzoor, a researcher and educator deeply passionate about understanding how higher education institutions adapt, innovate, and empower students to thrive in a globalized world. Today's episode is titled Global Education Local Impact. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Justin Williams, an accomplished educator and academic leader with over 2 decades of experience spanning Canada, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Dr. Justin's career reflects a profound commitment to student centered learning, international collaboration, and innovation in higher education. Currently, he serves as Associate Vice President Academic at British Columbia Institute of Technology, and he has held leadership roles as Dean of Commerce and Business Administration at Douglas College, Dean of Business and Tourism at Niagara College, and Director of Global at Niagara College. Dr. Justin has guided teams of faculty and staff in advancing academic excellence, equity, diversity, and inclusion across large multidisciplinary divisions. His rare blend of industry expertise and academic insight, shaped by more than a decade of international experience, has enabled him to lead transformative global education projects in partnership with organizations like UNESCO, Global Affairs Canada, and the Inter American Development Bank. Through international strategies, public private partnerships, and capacity building initiatives, Dr. Justin has left a meaningful impact on higher education institutions worldwide. With expertise in international management, cross cultural leadership, strategic management, and corporate training, Justin continues to shape the future of education with visionary leadership and a global perspective. Dr. Justin, welcome to the show.
Well, good morning and thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's dive right in. You have led education projects in Canada, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. What does balancing global and local mean to you in higher education?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You'll see across the landscape in Canada, different colleges and universities focused on different areas. Some are more focused externally, looking at international partnerships, and others are more inwardly focused and more focused on the Canadian market. I think it really depends on, what your vision is, for higher education, for the institute that you're working in. Most basic sense, we all want to serve, our students and support our students locally. But for that, to be honest with you, that can actually mean looking globally, because the international experience can often lead to new opportunities and new experiences and new competencies for our local students. So I think the balance at the very base would always be to support your students, but that can look quite different depending on which institution you're at and what the vision is for that institution. We at Niagara, we had significant focus on building global competencies for our students. So that meant not only do they get global expertise and experience in the classroom through their curriculum, through COILs, so working with other international educators in a different country, co-teaching a course, but it also could mean international field schools. We had a program called Be World Ready, which was gave students an opportunity for that international experience. And it was really powerful. Our mobility rates in Canada compared to many other parts of the world are quite low. Our mobility rates are, I believe, about 5% at the university level and 1% at the college level. That's far below what you'd find in Europe, for example, where it can be 20 to 35%. There's a huge recognition in higher education about the value of global experience and global competencies, but it's challenging for a number of reasons. Financially, it can be challenging. Taking time off, it can be challenging. These agreements are also fairly challenging to put in place sometimes, and all parties have to be very committed.
Absolutely. Building on that, why is it important for colleges and universities to prepare students both for global careers and for local labor markets?
I think 50 years ago or 40 years ago, it was very unusual for us to be working offshore. Expatriates were relatively small in number. Now what we're seeing is much more mobility in the workforce. I believe 2.5 to 3.5% of the world's population is mobile or expatriate. And you've seen through globalization a huge rise. Maybe to a lesser extent in Canada, but I think globally that's a huge trend. And I think it will probably continue. We'll continue to see, although we've seen obviously some slight reversals, I think, in terms of sort of global relationships and globalization. There's been some reversal lately, especially south of the border, but I think that trend will continue to increase. We need to be able to prepare our students to work with people from different backgrounds. If you're from, a small town in British Columbia or a small town in Ontario, it may be very difficult to get that exposure. And so it might be a huge shock when you suddenly find that the workplace is very multicultural. And so it's very important to be able to build those competencies in early on. I think one of the other things that I would say is that we want to build global citizenship into everything that we do for our students. I think it's really important that we graduate people who are, culturally aware, who see the world through a global lens rather than, just a myopic lens, and realize that, have an awareness that the way we are doing things is not the only way to do things. And being open to new ideas, new concepts, new cultures, I think, is very, very healthy and really important for our students.
In your experience, where do institutions tend to overemphasize one side, global or local, at the expense of the other?
Yeah, well, I think it depends what we're talking about. No question, I think over the past 20 years, international students coming into Canada has been a very important part of the education landscape, particularly in Ontario and slightly less extent British Columbia and Alberta. And so if we're looking at it from that perspective in terms of international students coming in, I think it's complicated. And I think it's complicated for a couple of different reasons. I'd say one complication has been the funding model that we have. As you know, education is a provincial mandate. Percentage of GDP education has been declining in terms of funding from the provinces over the past 20 to 25 years. It used to be 7 to 11%, I believe. Now it's down to about 3%. So this has placed enormous pressure on the university and college system. And so some of those universities and colleges have looked at internationalization in terms of bringing in foreign students as a way to offset those the funding the decreases in the province. The challenge with that is that at its core, the college system was really created to democratize education. It was to give education to everybody equally. It's open access. For example, for myself, I went to college before I went to university. I had a fantastic experience at college. And I went late. I was 22 years old when I started college. And that's really what the purpose of the college system is. But when the college system starts to serve only international, then that can be challenging and it can also be a risk. So I'd say it really is important to remember that, the core purpose of the college system and to a certain extent the university system, is to serve the local population. So I think that can get out of balance. And I think it has over the past, at certain places, certain institutions over the past 5 to 10 years. So it's just very important, I think, again, to go back to my earlier point, to remember who are we serving. The other thing that's complicated about that, of course, is how our education is set up in relation to immigration. And so education, like we were just discussing earlier, is really a pathway into citizenship, or it has been traditionally in Canada, which is an absolutely brilliant way to do it. It allows Canada to ensure that our students and the students that are coming through, international students, have received a Canadian credential, have had 2 to 3 to 4 years in the Canadian system, and then can really easily move into employability in Canada. So it's been very, I think, well thought out. Certainly, they've had some significant challenge, but that's, I think, where I'd sort of say that balance is very important to remember what we're for at the base.
Mm-hmm. You have led international partnerships with UNESCO and Global Affairs Canada. How can partnerships like this help strengthen local workforce development?
I would say that if we're looking at how do we support workforce development in a country that we're active in, for example, I think it has huge implications, and I think it's incredibly positive. So, for example, I worked for the University of Calgary when I was in Qatar. I was director of enrollment planning there, and I actually was in Qatar for 8 years. And the impact on the local labor market was incredible. We saw a huge decrease in unemployment. We saw the employability of women uh, absolutely at par with men. That was very unusual for that region. And so, very, very positive, I think, in terms of the status of women, equality, very, very strong impact for sure. And so I think there are massive benefits when we can bring education offshore, for example, to a host country and provide training that's necessary. I think there's a real clear benefit to that host country. When I was in Malawi, we were involved in a program to support the decentralization of the college system. So it was upper level, it was policy related. We worked with the EU and UNESCO on that project. And the intention there was really to be able to allow each of the colleges in Malawi to be able to create and deliver their own curriculum. So certain regions, obviously on Lake Malawi, they might be more focused on maritime programs. If they were more inland, they'd be more focused on other types of programming like agriculture. So that sort of work at the policy level is also equally important because it allows those institutions to meet the needs of the local workforce.
That's insightful. Turning to faculty, what role should they play in ensuring that the globalized curriculum remains relevant to regional needs?
So most of our programs are developed for the faculty, but there's also a program advisory committee. So that's members of industry who are sitting there and they will meet 2 to 3 times a year to advise and inform the faculty who are developing the curriculum to make sure that it's relevant to workforce needs at the local level. So that happens. That's actually mandated by the province, both in Ontario and British Columbia, and it's something that has to inform curriculum development. When we look at how do we build in then, if we know that there's local needs, how do we build in global competencies? And I think that's an important question, and I think it's something that varies greatly from province to province, from institution to institution. It's very important, I think, to have certain outcomes, recognizing the importance of building that global citizenship that I was talking about before. But the core, the program outcomes need to be fairly closely linked with labor market needs.
So, when we talk about the program learning outcomes and the international students, then how do you think that the alignment happens? Like, yeah, those learning outcomes are really addressing the global students, international student context. How is it happening? Would you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the challenge, right? I mean, again, the programming in Canada, but the outcomes quite often are global in application. So we look for the same sort of things in certain professions. There may be differences, engineering in Canada, engineering in Cameroon, or engineering in, South Africa will look very, very similar. And as well, there are international accreditation bodies. So I think even though they're aligned local labor markets, they're also aligned with overseas labor markets as well. When you talk about building in global competencies, I think it's important for us to think about, well, what does that look like? We talk about cross-cultural communication, we talk about global citizenship. Those are really hard to measure, and it's very hard to know exactly what those competencies look like in application when the student graduates. I always think of it as, it's like any sort of curriculum that you're building, you want to ladder something in. And so starting, at the very foundational level with just a very brief understanding or small understanding of what global citizenship means, and then building on that through the student's academic journey. I'll never forget, there was a student, he was from a small town in Ontario when I was in Ontario, never been overseas before. And there was a field school. It was going to Germany for 2 weeks, and we were delivering a course in partnership with Erasmus. Two of our faculty would go over there, and he somehow ended up going on this. And he was absolutely petrified. He didn't want to go. He was really scared, never traveled outside of Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
And he came back, and he was a different person. He was absolutely enamored with the experience that he'd had there, his ability to communicate with students from different parts of Europe who were in the course with him. He continued to be very active in that. He found a real passion. He participated in a couple other semester exchanges. And then when he graduated, he was actually graduating to go and do his master's degree in Ireland. And I thought, what a beautiful journey, right? You've seen this young man change his perspective and truly become much more open-minded, but really much more of a global citizen than he was, 4 years before. And I think that's the beauty of that international exposure and that international experience. It can absolutely shape us. And it just starts with just a small experience. It could even be becoming friends with a student from a different country in your class. And that relationship can open your eyes up as a young person. And, I think it's incredibly impactful. I know from my own experience, just being able to meet people from different cultures and different parts of the world, it's enlightening and incredibly humbling, because we sort of think that our way of doing things is the only way of doing things, or the right way of doing things. And yet when you become more global, you realize there's so many ways to do the same thing, and they're all equally valid. They all make sense. And that's, I think it's a beautiful thing to recognize and appreciate different ways of doing things, different cultures. And that experience is so rich, it can really shape us.
Mm-hmm. And these sort of transformations are really phenomenal. How can employers and local industry inform curriculum without making it too narrowly focused?
Well, I'm a BCIT now, and BCIT is probably one of the larger institutes in Canada, and we are incredibly focused on outcomes and aligning ourselves with industry. And so, our programs are incredibly tight. They are very credit heavy, and they're very intense. And so they are, probably more than other institutes. They are very focused on, coming out and getting a job. And so there isn't as much room in there, at least on the face of it, to be able to provide, that global experience. And so, it's a very delicate balance. I think a lot of our students will come from other institutions with more of a liberal studies background, and then they'll come into BCIT for that real hands-on experience. As a polytechnic, 50% or 60% of our learning is by doing, as opposed to through theory. So how do you build in, those sort of opportunities for students to have international exposure and gain those global competencies? It's a challenge for us, but there are ways to do it. And I think we do offer mobility options. We do have relatively small, 10% of our population, 8% to 10% is international students. So there are opportunities in the class to get that experience as well. But I think it varies, to your question, institute to institute, college to college, university to university, and also program to program. Some programs, our business programs, have high mobility, high international experience, as they should, because as a business person, you have a high likelihood of working internationally or working with people from a different culture. Mm-hmm. So it definitely varies, and it is a balance.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Could you share some successful examples where internationalization has enhanced local employability?
In education, I think we focus quite narrowly on those learning outcomes and what those need to look like in terms of employment. But there's a bigger story there. And I think part of that story is that anybody working locally will have international experience or exposure. And so employers really value somebody who has had that international experience on some level and can demonstrate some degree of global competency, of intercultural sensitivity and awareness. And so I think just the very exposure that students get through some of the mechanisms that I talked about, like COILs or field schools, those offer enormous benefits in terms of being able to be employed. We are very multicultural in Canada, as you're aware, and so it would be unusual to be in a workplace where you aren't working with people from other cultures. And so we recognize probably part of the nice thing about multiculturalism in Canada is that we do get exposure just by being at work to different cultures. So I think in that respect, Shamima, thinking locally is also thinking globally, because they actually they're not mutually independent at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agreed. Because we don't actually have to go beyond the territory to have that exposure. It's happening even inside the country and having that kind of interactions. So, from the student's perspective, do they learn more toward global aspirations or local job opportunities?
I think it depends very much on the student, on the program, and the institution. I know when I was in the Middle East, most of those students were planning on staying local. They didn't really have aspirations to go anywhere else. When you look at students in Canada, I think students in Canada are becoming more interested and are exploring opportunities more probably than they have before. Generally, look, mobility is very low, right? We know globally, although it's increasing, it's a really small percentage. And I don't think it's on a lot of people's radars. When I went over and moved to Qatar, people thought I was crazy. They didn't have any, where I was coming from, which was Victoria, people just didn't leave and go to the Middle East for 8 years. That was, they thought it was unusual. And so that was 20 years ago. And I think things now have changed to a certain extent. And, my oldest boy is off in Switzerland, and I think people are more mobile, I think, than they used to be. But, probably not growing as fast as I would have thought. I thought things would have moved a little bit faster in terms of global mobility. But still seeing, multinational corporations, we're still seeing some of those mobility trends. And they'll continue. But most of our students that I see are more focused on, working here in Vancouver or working in Toronto. They're more focused on staying local.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about technical and vocational education, how do TVET models fit into the global-local balance?
We see a lot of students who come who might have had, more of a liberal studies education, come for more technical training. I think TVET is essential for globally. Like, I think it's really essential for any developing workforce to have TVET exposure. But it really, I think a couple of years ago, I would have said that's really focused on local employment, not on international employment. And yet the more I see sharing at the global level, like we're working with a TVET institution in Jamaica right now on an EV repair. So it's very unusual that I think TVET is so focused on local. There's actually a lot of international opportunities there.
Absolutely. A concern for many institutions is brain drain. What strategies can institutions use to prevent it while still encouraging global mobility for graduates?
I think we were just talking about changes in the education system in Canada. And I don't know if you followed the new federal budget. They're actually, for graduate students, no longer need, they're actually PAL exempt. That certainly has some implications, I think. And it tells you where Canada's going in terms of its national workforce strategy to try and bring in those students who are top achieving from outside of the country to come and contribute. It's a challenge for sure. And I think people inside Canada could be critical of the education system for pulling the best and the brightest into Canada. I don't know if the same is true in reverse. I don't know if the top Canadian students are leaving and working internationally. But I would say that, mobility and brain drain, very, very challenging problems to solve, right? Being able to be mobile, to go where you're going to get the best education, the best employment, those sort of things are very, those are what we all want, right? We all want to do well. We all want to get the best experience. Mm-hmm. And so, how do we change that? I think we change it by making our ecosystem more appealing and as a way to retain students. So as opposed to stopping them, let's actually motivate them to stay. I was recently in the Baltic states, and they have a huge problem. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they have a huge problem with brain drain. They just simply can't keep up in terms of pay. It's not easy for them to retain talent, and so what they see is a lot of their young people going to other parts of Europe, and so they're going to, they're leaving, going to Germany, where employability is high and the wages are high, or Switzerland, and because they're all part of the EU, mobility is kind of built in. Mm-hmm. So they really struggle with it, and they actually have got universities there. I was at Vilnius Technical University in Lithuania, and they were asking me, do you think students would be interested in coming to do a PhD here? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, what does it cost? And they said, oh, no, it's free. Well, actually, it's absolutely free. They can come here. So, creating that ecosystem mm-hmm. where, students want to stay or people want to stay, mm-hmm. I think that's the answer, as opposed to putting restrictions around, saying, no, you can't. That's probably not the best way. We just want to create that system where people want to stay.
Mm-hmm. How do cultural differences and cross-cultural management shape curriculum design for both global and local contexts?
It's interesting. In Canada, and I'd say to a certain extent Australia, we're very rigid in terms of how we develop curriculum. And, I see much greater flexibility in other parts of the world, certainly in Europe, how curriculum is developed. There's just a little bit more flexibility around it. So, and then if you go to other parts of the world, so for example, in Jamaica, the curriculum there is developed at the national level. All of the colleges have equal access to the curriculum. It's much more widely shared. And I was mentioning the system in Malawi. We taught the Canadian curriculum when we were in Qatar, when I was at the College of the North Atlantic, and we realized we had to adjust certain aspects to it. So I was teaching a course in conflict resolution. Well, conflict resolution in Canada looks a lot different than it does in the Middle East. So being culturally sensitive and understanding the nuances are really essential. I remember teaching a leadership course when I was in Iran. I had a chance to go and work with Royal Roads University in Tehran for a couple of months. We were talking about leadership models and styles. And I was talking about servant leadership and empowering your employees and distributed, models. And after, and this was a real eye opener for me, because I thought, I've got all the magic here. We've got all these studies and all this. And afterwards, one of my students, who was, probably 10 to 15 years older than me, had a couple of businesses. He was pursuing, a Royal Roads MBA, and he came up to me and he said, Justin, he goes, very interesting. He goes, that was very interesting. He said, but in Iran, that would never work. He said, in Iran, we have the carrot and we have the stick, and that is how we lead. And I, at first, because I was 35 years old, I thought, well, no, that's not right at all. Like, we know this model works. But again, without understanding that cultural context, of course, he knew far better than I did about what would actually work. So I think that's the other piece that I would come back to is, as educators, when we're developing curriculum, and if we're going to be delivering offshore or internationally, or even in our classrooms to international students, everything is context. Everything is context dependent, and that means culturally dependent. And we have to be really humble, because, like I said before, it may work in Canada, it may not work somewhere else, and I think we have to recognize that.
Yeah, absolutely. Institutions face rapidly changing local labor markets. What challenges have you seen in aligning curriculum with these shifts?
I think we're experiencing right now one of the fastest changing labor markets ever. We have had a series of sort of explosions in tech, globalization over the past 20, 30 years, and now we're on the cusp, if we're not in it, of an AI revolution. This, I think, is going to change how we do teaching, how we do education. We're realizing that our students now need AI skills now, and we have to be embracing artificial intelligence in terms of how we deliver our programming. So, how do we meet it? And I think Canada, our academic systems, like I mentioned before, they're generally provincially mandated, governed. A lot of the work that we do when we change curriculum above a certain percentage, it has to go through our education council or our senate. So that can take a long time. It can take 2 years to develop a new program. If we're doing a degree, it has to go through our DQuab, our provincial approval. These are really cumbersome mechanisms. And looking at trying to develop new programming, or even we looked at purchasing a program off an Ontario Institute, it still has to go through the same approval process, which can take up to 2 years. And they're expensive, right? And every program that you develop, it's probably between $50,000 and $100,000. So these are all barriers to our ability to respond to labor market needs. And we've pivoted, and BCIT in particular, we're a leader in micro-credentials. Micro-credentials, are a way for us to address workforce needs that happen very quickly. They're also, because our credentials, micro-credentials, we can change them very quickly. They don't take 2 years to change. And so we are probably one of the leaders in British Columbia around micro-credentials. And I see that as a way to address those changes. They happen quickly because our system is painfully slow and painfully expensive. Small tweaks we can make, but those large new program, if you want to develop a program in artificial intelligence, that'll be completed. We're in 2025 now, probably wouldn't enter the market until at the very earliest September 2027 or maybe even 2028. That's not very responsive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also agree with you that the preferences are changing because the students, they are not willing to tie them up with 4 years degrees and long-term commitment. Rather than they want to finish, graduate, get the job. So those kind of micro credentials are actually creating a lot of interest among the students these days.
I'll tell you something interesting. We have a badging system for our micro credentials. So you do one, and then you get a badge, digital badge that you can put on, or a credential. 50% of the students who take it don't even want it. All they want are the competencies. They don't even care about the credential component to it. And I think you're right. You touched on something that I think we haven't touched on, but I think we should be if we're looking and talking about globalization in higher education. And that is, what are the trends? Like, where are things going? And I think we're seeing a massive shift away from those 4-year degrees to 1 and 2 year credentials. There was a recent labor market survey saying that employability was actually higher with a 2-year diploma than it was with a 4-year degree. And if you think about that, that is a complete game changer. That's very, very new. We're seeing a shift, I think, away from liberal studies to more very focused education, which is good, but it's also bad. I was at a recent event in Singapore, and they were talking about the top. It's called the C100, the top 100 Canadian CEOs in Silicon Valley. And the guy who chairs this meeting, he said to us, and he said, "So what do you think their degrees are in?" This is the top 100 CEOs of tech firms in Silicon Valley, and probably computer science or maybe business. We went around the room, and he said, "No, it's liberal studies and social sciences." And I think that is sometimes missed. The value of those types of studies allow us to see the bigger picture. They allow us to see trends. They build the critical thinking skills. And I feel sometimes that we focus very much on those short-term credentials to just get into the job market. but we undervalue some of the benefits of, a liberal studies education. So while the shift may be to shorter, I think we still need to remember that there's enormous value in degrees as well.
Totally agreed. And when measuring success, how should colleges evaluate graduates' global readiness or contribution to the local workforce?
I think global readiness is hard to assess, right? There are
Mhm.
some measures out there. I actually think it's very hard for the Institute to say where they should be focusing. I think we do need to serve local labor market needs, there's no question. But also, it's that balance that we talked about earlier of building in, a sense of global citizenship, recognizing that we're all rowing in the same boat. We're all headed to a greater or lesser extent in the same direction. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's all of the above, and it's easy to say that, harder to do that. But I think if we are building our programs correctly, if we're giving opportunities to students, whether they're thinking and getting local employability skills or global skills, we're still giving back. And I think as institutions, it's important for us to think, yes, we want to serve local needs first, but we're also global citizens as well. And that's where I think there's enormous value. And I think having that sort of awareness that, yes, we do want to look after local needs, but that's not at the expense of doing other things and thinking globally.
Mm-hmm. So it's sort of coming hand in hand that they should be prepared in both way, like globally, locally. So any cases happen, they can move forward. There's no problem of doing that.
I think as an educator, you want to sort of take a step back and say, well, what do we want our graduates to look like? What competencies do we want them to have? How do we want them to respond in a multicultural workforce? How do we want them to think, when they see something happening in a different country or challenges? And, I think we want them to be concerned, to have empathy, to feel that, to a certain extent that problems, whether they're in a different country or not, still affect us all, and to have, I would say, a conscientious approach to everything that we do. That's so building in the sustainable development goals, for example, into education, I think helps to do that and build that awareness. I think is really important.
Yes, absolutely. Looking ahead, how do you see the balance between global classrooms and local jobs evolving over the next decade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're kind of. I mean, it's 2025. It's. I feel that we're at a fairly pivotal time. There's a lot of us and them thinking, and we're seeing that globally more than we ever have, or more than we have in the last 20 years. We're seeing more polarization. We're seeing more racism. I think only recently. I do think certainly that the cause of that is almost entirely social media. We're seeing, especially in some parts of the world, we're seeing artificial, problems. I would say things that are not at the root cause, like immigration, for example. Uh, Economic disparity that's happening is not because of immigration. Like, full stop. It's not. It's because we have a tax system that's incentivizing billionaires, at the expense of everyone else. And where I'm going with this is that I think we're going to decrease, in global mobility. I think we're going to see probably in the next probably 10, 15 years, unless things change around. I think we're going to see, certainly we're seeing it south of the border, and we may see it here in Canada. We're going to see more of a focus on in-country as opposed to external globalization efforts. And I think we'll see people becoming more focused on staying where they are simply because it's become more of a focus lately on a political level.
So, Dr. Justin, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Your experience and vision highlight the profound ways higher education can prepare students for a world that is both global and deeply local.
Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. And yeah, just really wonderful conversation.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of Changing Voices in Higher Education. Be sure to subscribe for more conversations on innovation, leadership, and the future of learning around the world. Until next time, I'm Shamima. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep learning because the future of education is now.